Effectively, the premise in USA versus Microsoft was a company had a dominant position in a very important product market that they leveraged to reduce competition and essentially force consumers to maybe buy bundled products that they didn't necessarily want or need. Does that apply here to either Google or Facebook?
I don't think so. These are very different issues. Each company faces different issues. So, there's no similarity in that way, I don't think. They all have, large market shares.
Right. What's the distinction between, Google's overwhelming market share in search that is different from what Microsoft had in operating systems?
Well, so Microsoft had a very large 90% plus market share, which is much larger, I believe, than Google has in search. It had that market share for over a decade. So the numbers and the time were much different. And what Microsoft basically did, had a very good summary. They used their market power to insulate themselves from competition, in particular the browser, which was a new product, to maintain their market share, and did a number of illegal things. They abused their market dominance. That's really the issue. Do these companies, have they abused whatever power they have?
So do these states' attorneys general, not have a case here? Literally, is there nothing to scrutinize with these companies?
Well, I think, as I said, the companies have large market shares.
Yeah.
And we're in the political season, and the big tech companies have been the focus of some people running for office. And so I think that's part of it. The Texas Attorney General, who's leading the Google probe, has complained about what he perceives as anti-conservative bias, which I actually find pretty troubling as a citizen, as a former law enforcement officer, and as a believer in the First Amendment. I think that's potentially a misuse of the antitrust laws, if that's the motivation here. So I think there's a sort of taint to this at the beginning, at least in that respect.
I would point out, by the way, Google does have, at least according to the latest numbers, 92.3% of the search market.
Yes, they have a large market.
So it's as large as Microsoft's was.
Right, but I don't think it's, they've had it for as long a period. Microsoft really had...
Does that matter? Does the time you've held it matter? Why?
It does. Because, as you know, given what you do, markets shift all the time. And they can turn very rapidly, particularly in the tech sector. If there's a new product that comes along, Google, when it had its search product, there were other search engines that were much more popular. And Google was perceived by consumers to be better, I think, which is why it has such a large market share. So that's something that should be rewarded if a company competes fairly and they have a better product and people like it. That's not a problem.
No, that's what Makin Del Rahim has told me a number of times as well. Of course, is the antitrust man at the Department of Justice. How long, given you, obviously you're working now with Google, but how long when you're on the other side do these things tend to take in terms of the state AGs or in the federal government in terms of the investigations themselves?
A long time. In Microsoft, I would say the investigation was maybe a couple of years, and then there was a trial, an appeal, and on for a long period of time. So I think it's a long way down the road. This is very early days. I don't think the investigations are terribly focused at this point yet. There will be document subpoenas. In the email era, there's hundreds of thousands of emails that have to be scrutinized.
Probably millions,
Millions, yes. I was being conservative.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of work.
On that point, what resources and personnel do the state attorneys general have, and what's the significance of them coming at this from a bipartisan basis while the Department of Justice and other agencies of the federal government are already looking into it?
Well, so as a former state enforcement officials, I defend the right of the states to enforce the laws. They have co-equal sovereigns in this area with the federal government. I always thought, is it a good use of our scarce resources? Because the states do have much scarcer antitrust resources than the federal government. So one of the considerations I always thought about when I was the chief of the Bureau in New York is the DOJ and the FTC going to do something? How many people do I have to throw at this? And you're thinking about lost opportunity cost. Because a lot of these offices are small. They have one or two antitrust AAGs.
Are they replicating some of the same things that are going on now at the FTC and DOJ?
Yeah, it's very unclear. I said it's very early days. It's not even clear what the FTC or the DOJ are going to do.
Are you saying it's a waste of their time and resources?
No. I think they have a legitimate interest if they want to do it, but I think they have to be careful because these are enormously intensive resource-wise, And the states have many fewer antitrust resources than the federal government. And if you, even in a state like New York, which has maybe 15 antitrust AGs, if you tie up 4 or 5 on a probe like this, is what we did in Microsoft, it might mean you can't do some other things. So you have to think about that. I mean, it's a legitimate question.
And just to get back to, what might be motivating some of this scrutiny, I mean, you mentioned that, yes, there are some people who think that there are sort of partisan search results in Google, and that has been out in the air there, but there are also small businesses that have complained about advertising policies at Google. Google does privilege some of its own internal sites in search results, perhaps, as opposed to third parties. So are there not things like that to consider?
Well, yeah, it's going to look into all that stuff. I'd say it's very early days. The FTC, as you'll recall, a number of years ago, had a very extensive investigation with respect to search and didn't find a problem. So that's really one of the questions that come to mind if search is the focus.
Yeah.
What has changed since the FTC? That was a unanimous decision by the FTC, three Democrats and 2 Republicans, all gave them a clean bill of health. So you have to ask yourself, what is different now?